I invite you to turn to the book of Romans, chapter 8, and our text today will be verses 18 through 22. This is God's word. Romans chapter 8, beginning at verse 18. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. The grass withers and flower fades, but God's word abides forever. One of my favorite singers is Johnny Cash from Kingsland, Arkansas. One of the reasons I appreciate him is his songs run the gamut from glee to grief and the sliding scale in between. In one song, he sang, "I'd love to wear a rainbow every day and tell the world that everything's okay, but I'll try to carry off a little darkness on my back till things are brighter. I'm the man in black." As we come to this passage, we see Paul, in a sense, as speaking of creation, personified as dressed in black. A pall cast over what we see and what we observe around us in nature. You can hear the moan. You can hear the deep sigh. It's as if the cosmos is crying out in a collective groan. And then Paul will go on in verse 23 to write, it's not only the creation, but we ourselves who are involved in this anguish, in this sighing. Who else is part of this lamentation unto hope? It is we ourselves. Well, this morning we'll focus on verses 18 through 22. And for a little context, we remember that in the preceding passages, Paul has emphasized the Spirit's testimony with respect to our faith. Notice in verse 16 that the Spirit has borne witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And now here in this passage, there's a continuation of the theme of witness bearing, now not directly to our spirits, but even from an unexpected source, from the ground beneath your feet, together with the starry firmament above and the watery depths below. You see, the apostle is saying, creation is communicating something to you. Do you have ears to hear? Are you perceiving what it is revealing to you? The created order voices what, according to this text? It voices a note of futility and of frustration. Not just a song of I'm walking on sunshine, but mixed in, can we say, that for creation there is the singing of the blue note, a sorrow, a weighing down because of what God has done. The sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed to us. He asks us to take out a scale, put out glory on one side, what is weighty and substantial on one portion, and then put on the other side of the scale the suffering that belongs to the present time. Paul wants us to see and be driven to this future glory which will be revealed to us, something that not only we are expecting, but creation is also longing for. Well, 3 points this morning as we take up these verses. Firstly, futility. Secondly, corruption. And finally, the pains of childbirth. Well, firstly, futility, verse 19. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. You know, the Proverbs tell us that hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a desire fulfilled is a tree of life. If we can personify creation here, as Paul does in verse 19, as having a kind of mind and will of its own, then we can say that creation has a kind of heart sickness. Until when? Until the time when the sons of God, when the children of God are revealed for who they really are, namely the resurrection day. The earnest expectation of the creation, it is mingled for the time being with tears, because what it looks for and what it longs for has not yet arrived. Beethoven was a brilliant composer who was going deaf, and while composing some of his later pieces dealing with hearing loss, he would put his ear as close to the piano as possible so he could detect the vibrations of the notes, to get their vibes, as we might say. The Apostle Paul is putting his ear close to the earth, close to the ground, and what he hears is the sound of an eager longing and groaning. Undoubtedly, Paul is a theological listener, meaning he is out to hear what creation is telling him with regard to what God is saying, what God is doing. There is no place, you see, in Paul's thinking for creation as a category apart from the Creator. No, for him, this is my Father's world, both in the whole and in the parts. God has left his signature because nature is his handiwork, his workmanship. Remember earlier in the letter, in chapter 1, Paul's already established that God's invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. Here in this passage, though, Paul moves from Genesis 1 and 2, and God's making all things out of nothing by the word of his power. Now he moves to Genesis 3. How do we know that? Because of what he writes in verse 20. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. This note of futility is a different note than what we find in Genesis 1 regarding the fullness and the fruitfulness of the creation of the heavens and the earth. You see, this subjecting to futility is not part of the original design, but it happens after God has formed and filled the earth, after he has given life and breath to all things. What is verse 20 referring to? It refers to the judgment in Genesis 3 that God announced to Adam following the fall, following his disobedience and sin. Remember, Adam's nickname is Dusty because he was made from the dust. And the Lord comes in judgment against Adam for his sin, but he does something to Adam by putting the ground from which he was made under the curse. And now, Genesis 3, God assigns to the dust a function it did not have in the original creation, which is now to have it become a site of decay and of death. You see, verse 20 is apostolic commentary on Genesis 3:17 through 19. And to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you are taken. For you are dust, and to dust you will return. Creation's life under the curse mirrors the life of the image bearer under the judgment of God. It's almost as if the ground itself becomes bruised, becomes wounded on account of human corruption and disobedience. Creation not fully incapacitated, not ground to a halt, but like us who live under the sun, it struggles mightily to work. One poet says it well: all is bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell, the soil. Now in verse 20, in saying creation was not a willing party to this subjection to futility, notice creation was subjected to futility not willingly. Paul is saying that creation did not volunteer for this role of futility. What does Paul mean by this? We'll go back to Introduction to Philosophy and remember that good is that which fulfills its purpose. A hammer is good inasmuch as it is able to help you hit the nail on the head, but if the hammer head flies off in the process, you rightly say, that's a bad hammer. A tire on the car is good insofar as it keeps spinning smoothly to get you from one place to another. And so when it comes to creation, subjected to futility, there is a way in which creation must now serve a purpose that cuts against its own grain, that rubs against the way it was designed. Calvin says that God had made this world as a theater for his glory. And thus, in the beginning, that glory is everywhere on display. In opening exercises, we've been singing Psalm 104, a psalm celebrating the vitality and flourishing of the natural world. God has wonderfully fit everything in creation to benefit from the whole. O Lord, how manifold are your works! In wisdom you have made them all. But now, following sin, there is a dark shadow that has come upon the visible world. There is no country you can go to, no people you can visit where this shadow does not reach. Yes, there is still life and liveliness to be found, but there is also now death that has been introduced alongside of life. Here we can make a brief takeaway with regard to defending the faith. Why? Because there is a widespread recognition that nature is not fully cooperating with us in our endeavor to secure life here. We're in this continual wrestling match, aren't we, against contingency and unpredictability on account of storms, fluctuations of all sorts. If we're being honest, material conditions are very often antagonistic, pushing back against us in our efforts to place an anchor beneath us so that we will not be moved. And as believers, we can take a text like this and share with our neighbors, yes, there is topsy-turviness. Yes, there is fundamental uncertainty connected with nature. It's baked in to the elements of the physical world. But God has a purpose in and through that. And I'd like to share that with you. This verse, really verses 20 through 22, is virtually an executive summary of the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, which we read from earlier, begins with this portrait of a sun that is making its circuits around the racetrack. And it's almost like a marathon runner, sweating bullets in finishing the race. The sun, which was, Genesis 1, made to govern the day, is now being spent. It's almost like this fatigue has set in. And so we read from Ecclesiastes 12 a vivid picture of the human body coming apart. And it's remarkable how much of that coming apart, this falling apart, is borrowed from terms of the natural world. The heavenly lights grow dim. The clouds obscure the sunshine. The grasshopper no longer hops, but drags itself like it's pulling a sack of bricks behind it. There is death not only for the image bearer, for the human, but there is also a deadly sickness that is reflected in the created order itself. Probably the most succinct statement of Ecclesiastes is from Ecclesiastes 7:13. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? Isn't that another way of saying what Paul does in this very verse? That creation was subjected to futility. Well, we have futility, but then secondly, we have corruption. According to verse 21, the subjection to futility is now further detailed as a bondage to corruption. It's noteworthy, isn't it, that Paul has already spoken of this bondage and this slavery back in chapter 6. We have had once in sin presented our members as slaves to unrighteousness. But now Paul broadens this, and he speaks as if there's a ball and chain around the whole globe itself, the land and the sea and the air. You who are scientists are well familiar with the second law of thermodynamics, otherwise known as entropy. You leave anything alone, anything by itself, whether it's a building or statue or living room, and what happens to it? There is a crumbling that happens. Dust gathers, withering, decay sets in. Now, believe me, I'm no physics teacher, but what you learn in physics actually harmonizes very well with what the Bible teaches. General and special revelation never ultimately contradict one another. For Paul here in this text, it's as if a giant crack has formed in the granite of nature. And the crack does not stay hairline size, but it grows, it widens. And so does the groaning that grows with it. What once had a fundamental integrity and wholeness, now death has been invaded the scene, and now there are fissures and fractures found in the very warp and woof of the world. Creation experiences what he calls here in verse 21 a bondage to corruption, or one translation has a servility to decay. I think one good way to understand this is to skip ahead from Genesis 3 all the way to the end of the book of Genesis, the 49th and 50th chapters. And there in the final chapters of the book, you might recall that this is the tail end of the story of Jacob's death and burial. What really stands out here is that the land of Canaan, which has already been promised to the patriarch Abraham, we're used to hearing of it in connection with fruitfulness, fruit trees, which are the biggest, and fruits which are the sweetest to be found in all the earth. But now, according to the end of Genesis, what purpose will the land serve for God's people? It will be a cemetery for those who return to the dust when the Spirit returns to the God who gave it. If you look back there in Genesis 49, Jacob is giving instructions to his sons concerning what to do with his body after he is gathered to his people. And he says to them, "Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, in the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with a field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah. In the very final chapter of Genesis, Genesis 50, you have this giant funeral procession from Egypt to Canaan, where the sons of Jacob gather and proceed to bury their father Jacob. And if you haven't gotten the point by now, Moses writes of the death of Joseph in the final words of the book. And the final verse describes how Joseph was embalmed and put in a coffin in Egypt. How does this relate to Romans 8? Well, it relates because the story of Genesis matches exactly with what Paul is writing here. God originally made a garden of life. But now the story ends in the first book of the Bible with this garden becoming a graveyard of sorts for Joseph's bones eventually. Clearly, Paul's finding creation as being in bondage to corruption is tracing the very storyline of Scripture. The very soil in which life was to be planted and life was to emerge is now forced, not by its own decision, but because of him who subjected it, to be the site of burial, to be a holding place for the dead. Even the highest expression of the blessing of God in terms of the land of Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey. The first details we really read about it in Genesis are of one of the tombstones, of it becoming the graveyard of the patriarchs. Paul writes here of the whole creation being subjected to futility and subjected to bondage to corruption. We read in many of the prophets how the land had become barren. For example, in Jeremiah 12, many shepherds have destroyed my vineyard. They have trampled down my portion. They have made it a desolation. Desolate, it mourns to me. Once you could go and sit under your own fig tree and vine, enjoying the shade, enjoying the prosperity. But now there is a withering of those vines and figs. There's a decay that has set in. The curse has come on account of the sinfulness of God's people. And what is this doing? It amplifies and it magnifies the curse of Genesis 3. God, on account of human evil, now sends blight in the baskets and the kneading bowl. He sends drought, he sends mildew that pursues the people until they perish. Deuteronomy 28. It is all to declare, in no uncertain terms, that this is not their final resting place. This is not their forever home. God is telling us, you have defiled this temple space of the land. Therefore, the glory of God, the majesty of God can no longer rest there. It cannot be rooted here any longer. And friends, if that is the case for the promised land, which is the best it gets for this earth, then by extension, the whole rest of the inhabited world shares in exactly what Paul teaches here in verses 20 through 22. The cloud of chaos and woe hangs everywhere. Picture in your mind's eye, or look up later, the painting from 1893 by Edvard Munch called The Scream. A man on a bridge over menacing waters. It's like the sky is on fire, and this figure straddling a human being and a skeleton, He has his hands on his cheeks, and he utters a scream in fear. It's really brilliant because the canopy of water of the river, it's either coming out of the man's head or flowing into it, depending on your viewpoints. And it's not only this man screaming, but it's really the whole environment that seems to be fulminating and fuming as well. Well, are we to read this text as a dystopian one? Bleak darkness at the end of the day? I'm glad you asked, because the apostle wants to bring us from the bad news to the good news. Futility, corruption, and finally the pains of childbirth. Now I've stacked it so that the light is saved for the end, because actually in the verses we've looked at, notice the glimmering and glowing of this light. Verse 20, for the creation was subjected to futility not willingly, but because of him who subjected it. Notice the important words, in hope. And then verse 21, the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption. And what will happen? It will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. And then in verse 22, he says, for we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. The pains of childbirth are among the sharpest and most intense to be felt on earth. It's interesting to me, here we have an echo of Genesis 3 again. We've already referred to the curse announced to Adam, but recall too that to Eve the woman, God had declared to her, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. And now, Paul, under the inspiration of the Spirit, is able to tie together the curse both to the man and to the woman, both to Adam and to Eve, and explain them in terms of the groaning of the whole creation here in verse 22. What is the difference between birth pangs and death pangs? What is the end result of the pains of childbirth? It is the bringing of new life into the world. Sorrow gives way to life. Anguish gives way to the delivery of one who is a new human person. Jesus even speaks of this when he teaches his disciples in the upper room. When a woman is giving birth, she has sorrow because her hour has come. But when she has delivered the baby, she no longer remembers the anguish for joy that a human being has been born into the world. What Paul is conveying to us here is that the groaning and grieving of the whole creation, it is akin to that of a mother, that of looking forward to the life she will bear that will be brought to her and through her. The earth is on the precipice of the birth of a whole new world. And just as in the beginning, when God called the vegetation and plants to yield fruit, God, the consummator, in the end, will call the earth to give up the dead and for the children of God to be raised incorruptible, imperishable, immortal. You see, the apostle builds upon the firm foundation of the prophets. Isaiah 26, we were pregnant, we writhed, but we have given birth to the wind. We have accomplished no deliverance in the earth, and the inhabitants of the world have not fallen. From the perspective of Israel in the flesh, with her own resources, her own wherewithal, she has not been able to yield life and fruitfulness. But then notice the promise. Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is a dew of light, and the earth will give birth to the dead. Israel, unable to bring about the seed of life, the seed of promise, in and of herself. She is unable by herself to crush the head of the seed of the serpent. The inhabitants of the world have not fallen. Namely, the enemies, including the final enemy of death, remains standing. But God promises final victory through his deliverance. The earth will give birth to the dead. Verse 21 is the fulfillment of that. The creation will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. Beloved, the beginning of that new birth has already taken place as Christ, the firstborn among many brothers, emerges from the tomb. And we, who are in him and with him, in a manner of speaking, are a part of the same womb of the resurrection, ready to come out, ready to be clothed with that weight of glory that our elder brother has already received, to enter the rest he has already secured. The church is shaped in the way of cross-bearing until the resurrection in the end. The creation itself bears witness to it, with the futility and corruption preceding the glory that is to be revealed. These burdens that are borne both by ourselves and by creation around us, they are part of the paving stones that God is using to prepare us for this eternal weight of glory ready to be revealed. At the end of the novel, The Brothers Karamazov, young men have seen terrible and awful things. They come and ask the Christian brother Alyosha a question. Can it be true what's taught us in religion, that we shall rise again from the dead and shall live and see each other again? In other words, is what we've learned in catechism class true? Alyosha's answer, I believe like a child that suffering will be healed and made up for, that all the humiliating absurdity of human contradictions will vanish like a pitiful mirage. In the world's finale, at the moment of eternal harmony, something so precious will come to pass, it will suffice. It will comfort all resentments. Creation is waiting for this day, is groaning for you to be transformed, for your mortality to be swallowed up by immortality, for your lowly body to be made like Christ's glorious body. If that is the hope of creation itself, should it not be your hope as well, to groan inwardly as we eagerly wait for the adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies?